during the pandemic, my bandmate Alan and I got a studio here in Brooklyn, and over the last few years we built it out, and we also have a record label that is based out of here. So my days are this sort of weird potpourri of, studio and label stuff, listening to, label submissions and talking about that kind of stuff with our label manager, CN. But then I do a lot of, I'm always writing. That's, my main job. So I'm like, I don't know, yesterday I spent half the day making scores for this musical that I'm working on, and then the other half listening to submissions for next year for the record label. So kind of every day is a little different.
I was listening to an interview that you did a few years ago, and you referred to the composition as a day job. It's funny because I like sheer coincidence. I'm reading the Philip Glass book that came out a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Have you read that?
I haven't, but I'm pretty familiar with his life story.
One of the things that I found hopeful in the book is that he was doing like day jobs until he was like 41, driving cabs, putting up drywall, things like that. As far as day jobs go, you've got a pretty good one. Yeah,
I was really lucky with how it started, because I think for maybe my junior and senior years of college, I was working, while I was a student, I was working as a musical assistant for Nico Muhly, who actually was the musical assistant for Philip Glass for a while. So it's kind of a small, easy connection there. But, and so I was doing kind of two jobs at once, being a student and kind of coming into the city when I could to run recording sessions and hacking my way through, various, making parts for things and just running sessions for him. And then I did that for him for about a year after graduation. And then in a very sort of like old fashioned way, San Fermin got picked up for a record deal, like off of our first show. So I kind of never had quite that, putting up the drywall phase. And I feel like I'm doing a delayed version of that now, doing all the sort of stuff with record label and studio maintenance and all these things that are much more like, they have a kind of a set schedule.
That's also a pretty good day job to have, is having to listen to artists all day.
It's really nice, and it puts you in this different mindset. One of the reasons that we did the label was that I just felt like I was getting sort of like siloed and isolated as a musician, and that seemed sort of counterintuitive to the whole point of making music, which is a social event and something that you share with people. It's about connecting. And I just felt like on tour, I was just me and my bandmates and against the world. And I didn't actually love that feeling because it felt so isolated. And so actually one of the nice things now is on the label side is just, being connected to a larger web of people and having a reason to really actively engage with other people and root for other musicians.
It's funny to describe being in a band as solitary, I guess, relative to these other connections, but it's certainly a theme that runs through a lot of what you do. I mean, one with the bands, at certain points, the band has been, double digits. The band has been 3 to 4 ska bands in size.
I like measuring things in ska bands. That's good.
It is an unpopular unit of measurement in 2023. The label's mission statement also seems to be entirely collaborative in a sense as well.
Yeah. I think partly because of my experience as a composer, which is, I feel like, being a composer for contemporary classical ensembles and orchestras and whatever, there's this really weird divide between the writing process, the generation of the material, and then the performance. And sometimes there's years between when you write it and when it happens, and there's this kind of artificial thing going on. There's even a weird power dynamic where you come in to say you give an orchestra your score, and there's this, on the one hand, you're sort of the dictator. On the other hand, they're giving you 35 minutes during their rehearsal. It's just a weird thing. And so I don't love that dynamic of separation. It doesn't feel right, and it never did. And so the label, I think, is kind of my way to actively push against that kind of the siloing of musicians and to actively promote this sort of cross collaborative community.
What form does that take, though, in terms of the actual label? And what does collaboration look like?
It depends. I mean, during the pandemic, like one of the projects we did was San Fermin did this collaborative EP, and it was like 6 tracks with just friends of ours and musicians that I admire. And that was, as many people's experience during the pandemic, that was very... it was collaborative while being distanced. So like there was, that was a Dropbox album. There's a lot of like, hey, check this out.
That was your postal service record.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So that's kind of one way. But now that things are more or less back to normal, we have this recording studio in the front of the building here, and every day there's someone new in there. And, usually it's just they're doing their thing. They're working with Alan, our singer, he's a producer as his day job. He produces albums. And so sometimes they're doing that. Sometimes it's someone recording something for me. A lot of times it's just people in there doing their own thing. And there's just something nice that comes from popping your head in, saying, hey, kind of listening, that I find... when I was writing in my basement for 8 years, I was not getting that. And so I would find myself in these much more sort of like isolated kind of holes. Whereas now I feel, more connected to what's going on around me.
What does it take in 2023 to launch a record label? I know like you're working with Orchard, which is pretty good as far as distributors go, but I don't even know, aside from some familiar names, I don't know what do record labels do these days? Is that a fair question?
That's a very fair question. Well, I have to say I've never really wanted to be on the record label side of the exchange, right? Like I've had, our first couple records came out with Downtown, and then we worked with Interscope, and then we were with Sony. And so I've done the major label thing, and, a lot of really wonderful people in those spaces, a lot of people who listen to music and care, and they've brought you in for a reason. But I always felt like there was this real, you sort of show up in this conference room. And I remember I went into the meeting with Sony. This was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and they said, "Who's your audience?" And I was like, "I don't know. You tell me." And they said, "Well,
that's your job to figure that out."
Exactly. And then someone sort of raised their hand and said, "Well, I think it's 6-figure hipsters." And I was like, "Oh God." So I think there's this kind of weird sort of corporate speak that happens, in those spaces that I really didn't. I just don't feel like it's very connected to my feeling of what I'm actually doing. So to answer your question on what labels do. I think what I want ours to do is just to kind of be transparent and to be as little of a presence as possible in that way with artists. Basically, because we have a studio, Better Company Studios, that we run here, it's more, we're trying to be a resource. So we're saying, hey, you have a record, great, come make it here. That's awesome. We love that. If you want to work with me as an arranger or whatever, if you want to work with Alan as a producer, that's great. If not, that's also great. And then we'll sort of shepherd it out into the world. And what that looks like is basically hiring a really amazing Australian label manager named CN, who, she's our everything. And she has this sort of relationship with the distributor. And then she kind of basically is a storyteller to them. She says, hey, this is why you should care about this project that we just signed. Here is the story of them. And, and here's the music. But that part I am much less involved with, probably for the better for everyone.
I can't get over the phrase 6-figure hipsters. I mean, it makes sense. It's obvious. It's obvious, on the face of it, what that means, and it really is. It's kind of like the 20s version of yuppie, basically. Yeah. Right? Is that
it? It really set a weird tone for that whole meeting, I got to say, because I was looking around the room trying to say okay, who here is a 6-figure hipster? What does that mean? And also, I don't know. It's never nice to feel kind of pushed into a particular
pigeonholed.
Thing.
Yeah. I mean, some of my best friends are 6-figured hipsters, so I can't say too many terrible things about them. So what was the? what was the impulse to self-release this time out?
Well, because we had this label now, and so we've been working on it for the last 3 years. It was really our pandemic project because we were on tour, San Fermin. So we were signed in 2012. We put out our first record in 13, and we basically were on the road from 13 to 19. And I was sort of just, I was just juggling between tours. I was writing, music for ensembles and things like that and ballets. And then that was my life for 6 years solid, was tour, album cycle, and then like pieces in between. And when the pandemic hit, I mean, it was horrible for so many reasons. But one thing that was kind of nice about it, I suppose, in a weird way, was just that Alan and I had a moment to be like, okay, what is it that we want to do now? We've been killing ourselves physically. I mean, I have back problems, like, probably more emotional problems than I wish to
talk about on a podcast.
And, yeah, exactly. And like, it's, going on tour is this sort of like extended adolescence in a lot of ways, right? You're sort of running away from something or running to something, but also running away from it. And anyway, so we, when we decided to make the label, I thought maybe in 5 years it'd be nice for this to be a place that has enough sort of resources and connections for us to put a San Fermin album out through it. And then we really lucked out with some of the people that we hired. We have 2 employees here, and then we have the whole Orchard team, which is like 30 people that we work with there. And so Alan and I had a conversation about it about a year ago after I had written this record, this new one, and he was like, we would be crazy not to put it out through our own label here. Like, we have everything we need, and also, why not own the masters? So
no, I don't want to get too in the weeds with the industry stuff, but looking at the band's albums, so the first 2 on Downtown, and then Interscope, and then Sony. Mm-hmm. Were the Interscope and Sony records, or was the Sony record like a one record?
It was a 1 record deal. Yeah. Basically, so our first deal was with Downtown Records, and that deal actually basically took us all the way through that Interscope deal. And for people who are interested in, music industry biz stuff, basically it looked like a 2-album deal, and then it sort of ended up being secretly a 3-album deal where we were putting our second album out, and the label Downtown called us and said, "Hey, we want we want an option for your third." And the implication was, if we don't get that, we're not going to prioritize this release.
You were extorted a little bit there, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, on this scale of artists who have had bad experiences with labels, I count myself very lucky. And honestly, they took a chance on us. Like, Josh Deutsch, who ran Downtown, he came to one show of us at pianos where there was 15 of us on stage. And
at piano. So that's like, that was, I'm sorry, I keep going back to the ska measurement,
okay.
But there was that old, there's that old Onion headline that it was a ska band outnumbers audience. Pianos is not a large space.
No, it's very small. And I had an orchestral bass drum on that stage. It was so silly. And, and I have to give Josh credit. Like, he saw that show, which by all accounts was, chaotic. And also, there was a long distance between that and being a touring band, and he took a chance on it. So, I think there was a little bit of a gentle, extortion, as you say, like on that third one. But honestly, I don't hold any, I wouldn't have a career if they hadn't taken a swing on us. So, but anyway, through that whole process, and then we the first time we actually got to sign a deal, it was with Sony after that first one. And that was just like a one-off deal with them where, they, I had already made the record, and then they, came in and sort of bought it.
You only wanted a 1-album deal, though, it sounds like, so you had the freedom to do whatever you wanted with the next one. Yeah, and actually during that process, the Orchard is owned by Sony, and that's how we were connected to the Orchard, and that's how we have our own little label there. So there's a lot to say about the music industry. It's a pretty wacky, like fucked up place, to be honest. And there's a lot of really bad stuff in it, but
I am in a slightly better place now about all of it, feeling like it's nice to have a little more autonomy.
Again, just looking at this, the release date for, I think, the second part was the end of March 2020. Is that right?
Yeah. Oh my God. What a bad time to put a record out.
I mean, I'm sure you had tours planned, and how did that all go down?
Yeah, it was all canceled, as you can imagine. And even putting that out, it was like end of March 2020 was when the second half of our last album, The Cormorant, came out. And I remember even like posting about it. I felt like I was apologizing. It was like, hope this email finds you well. Like that kind of like, in this our time of need, here comes 8 songs that you don't need kind of thing.
I'm sure that you had a similar experience. I mean, I was dealing with other health problems and a lot of other stuff at the same time. And I know that for me, music played a big part in keeping me sane.
Yeah. And I mean, there was talk about a phrase that really cuts you down to size. Or when everyone was talking about essential workers, which is, it was really illuminating. It's like, wow, yeah, there are people who society needs, like truly needs, and then there's like me and all my friends who are just, the frosting on the cake. And I thought that was very centering to be like, okay, or I should say, grounding, to realize what a privilege it is to be a musician. And that everything else has to be working in order for us to, do what we do. But at the same time, I did think over the course of the pandemic, it was nice to remember that, that the arts are kind of like it's a thing that matters to a lot of people. And there was a real call for live music again. And, I don't know. It was just, I don't take any of it for granted anymore.
The essential worker thing, I think, for me, what it really put into perspective is how poorly we treat specifically the people that were like, there was that period. So we're both in New York. There was that time, at like 7:00 every night where people would go and applaud, which, nice, right? But like, is that helping? I don't know. Maybe
that's the Spotify royalties of actually showing appreciation.
And that's going to get real bad next year.
Yeah.
I assume you're above that threshold, but like really telling something like 2/3 of their catalog to go fuck themselves, basically.
Yeah, it's not a model that I understand. Yeah.
I mean, I understand it. I understand it from the standpoint that it makes Spotify a lot of money, that they can get away with it. But
yeah, that's right, for sure.
Again, obviously you enjoy your day jobs, but if you really wanted to just pursue the band full time, like, I don't know that that's something that you could even do at the level that you're at. Yeah,
it's interesting because basically the version of that works is, tour for 200 days a year or 180 days a year, which we kind of did through like 15, 16, 17. And it was really bad. Like there were some of the best years of my life, but everyone in the band, I think, could attest that, I think 2015, we probably played 120 shows, and we did a big opening thing doing stadiums, opening with Alt J. We did 3 headline tours. We did 3 nights at Bowery Ballroom. It was like a success of a year by all metrics, except for financial, where, we basically, were playing every night and feeling great about it. And then at the end of the year, I think the band members, no one made money at all. Like, people were really in the red from that whole thing. And so it's really, I think, being a musician in this day and age, unless you're above a pretty high threshold, has to do with versatility and, having sort of multiple ways to make it work. And honestly, it's a constant balancing act.
So is there like a pragmatic reason behind scaling down to the relatively small number of 8 people?
Relatively small. Yeah, I mean, basically, that was really a long time ago. So we did the in 2013 when I recorded the first album. There was 20 something musicians on it, and then when we did that show at Pianos, I think there was maybe 13 or 14. And then when I went into Josh Deutsch's office at downtown, he said, like, "Hey, we don't sign acts that don't tour. You need to tour," which was not something I was even thinking about. I was thinking about it as like an album, an art project, like just a thing that I wanted to do. And so at that point, I kind of took a look at the scores and thought, what can we get rid of here? And got it down to the still, I would say, extremely unmanageable number of 8 people. But, it was that was sustainable. If we played a lot of shows, it worked.
What does touring look like for the band these days?
Yeah, well, we're about to. So we have a tour happening starting in March and ending in June.
That's a pretty good run.
Yeah. It's some off and ons now because people have gotten a little. We're in our mid-30s, and I think people don't want to kill themselves quite in the same way. So we take a couple of weeks here and there,
and day jobs, and and families and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a couple. Yeah, our guitarists, both have kids and all that. So. Yeah, so we all pile in a Sprinter and we go from place to place. I mean, I think the thing that is so crazy about it is that for 1 hour a day when you're on stage, you feel like better than anything. I mean, I really think that performing with a band of people who you love, it feels like religion. It's like the most connected that I've felt to people is being on stage. And then for 23 hours a day, you feel like, it's like a bad day in LaGuardia, It's like, it's waiting for hours and eating junk and that kind of thing.
Props to LaGuardia people, because it's actually a nice airport now.
That's true. They've upped
one of the worst in the country, and it's pretty nice now.
Yeah, that's true, actually. Yeah.
What does it mean to conceptualize a band as an art project?
Well, so my background is that, I mean, I have always had, like in high school, I had rock bands that I played in, and then I played classical piano. And then when I went to college, I had a rock band I played in, and then I studied composition. And so I always had these sort of like two streams of what I do. My family are all visual artists. They're all from like the art world. And so I always kind of thought of them as sort of different. And I think there was a little bit of an idea of like, they're sort of going for different things. Like there was, when I was in bands in high school and in college, I was, it was about playing battle of the bands and like having fun. There was a certain social currency to it, and it was just fun to do. Whereas the classical music, I love notes. Like I love pushing notes around. I love creating these sort of networks of meanings. That these sort of syntaxes, like these languages that you create as a composer, and that feels really exciting. I mean, it's like a Sudoku that never ends in the best possible way. And so I had always sort of thought of those two things as separate. And when I did the first San Fermin album, it was the first time that I figured out how to sort of combine those two things and realized actually, like, it's like if you're starting a restaurant, it's like you want the restaurant, if you're the head chef, you want the restaurant to show, some kind of a, whatever your history is, like wherever you come from, whatever your, and I kind of come from these two different places, and I figured out how to kind of combine those. But it's led to some funny situations where, we're doing shows playing with orchestras and stuff like that, and then suddenly you're on the stage at Lollapalooza and you're trying to convince, the kids in the back of the crowd who are, wasted that they should stay and listen to your music. So those are just very different audiences, and so you have to kind of toggle your brain a little bit.
Not just a dichotomy between the composition and the band, but almost a dichotomy within the band itself.
Yeah, totally. And and within from song to song, I think that we've had over the years, we've had both one of the nice things and also one of the difficult things about this band has been that you don't quite know what you're going to get from song to song. There's, on our first album or our third album or whatever, there's like, I mean, just to take the first album, since that was the sort of what we were talking about, like there's, we had the song Sunsick, which was like XM radio and had a whole sort of like radio thing. And then like half of the tracks are interludes with just, new music string writing. And I think that people who don't know the band very well are like, what the hell's going on? And so over the years, as my career has kind of opened up, I think I've gotten a little bit, I'm happier to kind of find put each thing in its right place, and sort of not, every album doesn't have to contain everything. It can be a little bit more focused.
You were shoehorning things in a bit because it was something that you knew you could do. It's something you knew you were good at.
Yeah, and there's probably some ego in that. I think like I was, there was a little like fancy footwork kind of vibes in those early albums where it was like,
I'm not just a rocker.
Hey, Ma, look at me, and I don't sing, right? Which I think is a really important, a strange distinction for us between us and other bands is like, there's not, I mean, I heard you talking to Kristen Hirsch, who I love, and she was talking about how songwriters are always pregnant, right? There's like this kind of like this idea of, that you're always sort of like have this story that you need to tell, but you're literally singing it. Composers, I think there's a little bit of a different thing where you turn on the tap, and you sort of fill up the glass, and then you turn off the tap, and you can kind of think about it differently. And I am squarely in between those two because I can do both things, but when I'm songwriting, it takes a lot more out of me emotionally. And so I have to kind of like set the time sort of separate for those when I'm going to write an album. I'm like, okay, here we go. Like the next 2 months are going to suck, and I really have to sort of like delve down into what's actually going on in my emotional world.
Seems to be more the case on this record, perhaps, than any other one before it.
Yeah. Well, breakups, man, they're tough.
For sure. And you had two in quick succession, which really makes it hard to process both of them.
I think I was a real unreliable narrator for a little while, I don't know, I guess I hadn't really had that experience of such intense self-doubt about what was actually happening, like because I could just convince myself from day to day of just vastly different realities.
In terms of who you were in the relationship?
Yeah. Or what was happening in my life, like if it was a good thing, if it was a bad thing, if I was kind of flying off the handle, or if I was actually growing. And it was probably some combination of both, right? But it was a real reminder of, honestly, I mean, I think the takeaway from the whole thing was gratitude for the community of people around me who I leaned on in ways that I think back on it. I'm like, Jesus, I hope, I can only be so lucky to have friends like that for my life. And one of them, of course, is Alan, who's the singer of the band, and he produced this album. And God, that guy, he really stepped up during a difficult time. In
terms of helping you get your thoughts together, or helping you actually like make art from these horrible things.
Yes. And I mean, it was, he was really, and he brought some humor to the whole thing too. I was having like almost sort of like kind of like dissociative episodes. And then, I remember I came in one day to the studio, and I was like, I finally felt joy for the first time ever yesterday. And he just like literally laughed for 5 minutes at me, he was like, you stupid idiot. And I think there's something funny about, someone going through it where it's like, it both feels really real and melodramatic. And also, literally everyone goes through this all the time. I mean, the dude at your bodega, or the dude on the corner, or the person that wherever get your coffee from, like maybe they're going through that today. And I think there's kind of a humor and a surreality to the fact that both it feels like this kind of end of the world mental health crisis, and also it's like, hey, what everyone goes through all the time is this kind of upheaval and growth, and if I take away from anything from the whole thing, it was gratitude for the people around me, and also life is constantly throwing you curveballs, and you just have to be able to grow with it.
It is both the most personal thing that happens to you and the most universal at the same time.
Yeah, totally. And I think that was the takeaway for this one, where it was like, hey, I went through a very relatable couple, few months or half a year or whatever, and maybe don't worry about dressing it up too much. Just try to be a good observer of it and put that into words that are relatable for people, and let that do the talking.
It's also a funny thing in life that sometimes the best advice you can get from somebody is somebody who knows you really well telling you that you're a dumbass. Like, how useful.
Yeah.
That your head's up your own ass, or that, you're, that you have like no real context for this thing as you're going through it.
Totally. I mean, there's nothing worse than like a self-important, I think it's so easy to get caught up in the sort of narrative of your own nonsense. And like, I think a really important part of a good friend is someone who can kind of just undercut it and say, hey, this is I'm sorry that you're having a tough time. I'm glad that you're growing, and also I'm laughing at you. It's like kind of nice, actually.
You said you're having like, I don't know exactly what phrase you used, but almost like borderline dissociative episodes. Like, how does that feel? Like, how did that manifest itself?
I just, I without making it to anything more than it was, I just think I would just be sitting at my computer and suddenly feel like everything just like would go sort of shiny and weird, or would just have these sort of moments of like feeling like really, really light. And, I think that's, I've dealt with anxiety for my whole life. So, it couldn't have been a helpful thing at that point. But I think also there are so many little markers all around you that are kind of surreal that you have a hard time, finding handholds, right? Like, going back to my apartment, and exactly half of everything is gone. Half the books of the shelf are gone, and the couch is gone, and stuff like that. And so there's this kind of dream like logic that seems to kind of kick in during that time, where, you feel like you have half the handholds that you normally do on a day-to-day basis.
It's a good way of putting it. And I guess the context that's important here is that the two of you were living together, and that it was like a 10-year-long relationship. So it was, it feels surreal because all of a sudden, like, your life is markedly different.
Yeah. And, I've always had a tough time. I guess I'm not the kind of songwriter generally who wants to take something directly from my life and just pop it on the page. The sort of like, diary kind of like, so there are people who are just so good at that, like the Liz Phair's or honestly the Kristen Hirsch's, or there's just so many people who can do that really well. But like I think my diary entries are really embarrassing, probably. So I just don't. I've always over the course of my career have filtered through characters or literary references or films and I with this album, I didn't want it to feel confessional in that way, but but I didn't want to be adding artifice to something that felt raw. So it just, a big part of the experience was working with Alan and with Claire, our other singer, and basically saying like, hey, here's this thing, and then finding the section of the Venn diagram where, my like lived, whatever my experience was, could kind of overlap with something that they could find their way into. And that, I think that during that process, there was a lot of negotiation, probably for the better.
So it's really, in a sense, it's important for them to find their emotional connection to the songs that you're writing. Yeah,
they have to, because I think especially in this particular genre, the sort of like song indie sort of whatever songwriter world, so much of the way that people interact with it is it's like, if you listen to a Sufjan song, it's like he's talking to you. It's like it doesn't have that kind of remove that like the classical world has, where you go see when, a Shostakovich, piece, but he's not sitting in the room with you.
Or it's Bach and it's somebody from hundreds of years ago.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. So I think that, but my impulse to write has always been to bring people in closer to me. I think like I often feel kind of lonely. I have kind of a, it's a constant companion for me, and the process of bringing people into my experience, that connection of writing, and then having the connection between the writing and the performing, that's like, amazing. That's like where the magic happens and where I feel really connected. And so for this kind of writing, it has to feel like it's coming from Alan or it's coming from Claire. Because if it doesn't, it's like, first of all, I failed as a songwriter. And second of all, I think people just don't buy it. It's got to be personal.
What's that negotiation process like?
Very complicated, or no, I should say textured. Layered. Yeah. Alan and I, we've been doing this since we were 15 or 16. And in every sort of iteration, like he used to write songs that I would produce when we were teenagers, and then I wrote songs that, and now I write songs that he produces, and so we've had this kind of long collaborative relationship that, and we're also, he's my best friend, so we have this kind of lived shared biography almost, like, oh yeah, like that time that we were wherever on tour, but also that time that we played in a basketball camp when we were 15. Like, there's just this sort of, and so I think he's pretty good at sniffing out where it doesn't feel real. I think he's really good at seeing when I'm trying to get too in my head about it or fancy with it, and he's really good at undercutting that. And he's all about simpler language, and he's about sort of like delivering the kind of the punch you in the gut line, but in a way that feels plain rather than highfalutin. And that's really, really helpful for me particularly. And, and I think he's also thinking about how is he going to perform it. And I think that's where his, sort of the character of his songs comes from, because we have this shared section of our Venn diagram, but then also there's a whole part of me that I think he doesn't really relate to or want to, sing. And so that's where Claire comes in, and, and that's, she comes from a much more, like, she comes from a theater background. She understands how to take a text and find her way into it. And also, I think generally the songs that I've written for the female voice channel a little bit more of that anxiety and a little more of the sort of panic, fight or flight thing that I have dealt with for a lot of my life. And she's really good at finding her way into that. I think she can relate. The
thing that struck me the first time I heard his voice is how much he reminds me of Bill Callahan. I don't know if that's like
totally.
I know it's something you heard a lot, but it does.
Oh yeah, love him.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about his voice and the way he sings that is, or like David Berman, or but it's very raw and it's very immediate.
Yeah, and he's Bill Callahan's a great example. I feel like whether or not he's trying to sound that way, there's something about that voice that is reassuring and kind of caretaking almost. Like there's a kind of a it'll pass kind of feeling to a lot of that. And, Alan, I think, is very comfortable in that role, both in his life and in as a singer. And so generally the songs that I end up writing for Alan take on a little bit of that character.
It's clear during the writing process who is going to sing them ultimately.
Up until this album, yeah. I always was like and for the first few, I was like really, delineated with it, where I would, I write everything out as a score, or at least historically I have. And so I would come into the recording sessions, like in the studio, and I would have it notated. I mean, Alan doesn't really read music, and so the vocal stuff would be a little bit like we would kind of figure it out in the room a little more. But like it was very almost like sort of operatic in terms of the back and forth. But this album, the challenge that he set for me, which I really enjoyed, was write everything at the piano. Don't think about arrangements. Don't think about album order. Like, treat each song like it's its own thing, and let's figure out who sings it later. And that was like really new for me.
It's liberating in a sense of not, as somebody who, again, this is something that we share, but as somebody with a lot of anxiety, of not having to worry about that and just letting the music do its thing, what it needs to do at that point in the process. Yeah,
totally. I actually think that the thing that was the most liberating about it was, I'm now 10 years into this, and when I was starting, I just felt like everything had to have everything in it. I felt this kind of operatic emotion. I mean, the first song I ever wrote for the band was like, it had this big choir of singers and also string quartet and all this stuff, because it just, that's what it felt like. And now there's this kind of liberating feeling too of like, there are just many ways to tell different kinds of stories. Earlier this year, I put out a classical album where it was a singer and a string quartet, and we were doing these kind of haunted texts that I worked on with my friends Karen and Carrie, and that had a whole different thing. And then this album doesn't have to be that. This album can be, just talking about a shitty experience that I had, and I think finding the right sort of places for the right kind of storytelling has been an interesting journey through the last few years.
Yeah, it's also relatively stripped down, like sonically, from past records as well. Was that a conscious decision to find a way to make the songs more immediate?
Yeah, totally. It was, I wasn't, because I had been instructed to write these songs at the piano, and, basically like, if they worked with me singing and just a piano, then, everything was going to be better from there. So
what do you mean instructed?
Because I was like, hey, I want to write this album, Alan. I have all these thoughts, like, talk to me about basically I just was like, hey, I'm going to do this. And he said, try this thing, let's try something different here. And, Alan did. Yeah. And it was really nice, because in the past, it kind of went the other way, where I would be like, hey, this is what we're doing here. We're making a concept record about a ghost bird, and he'd be like, all right, man, I'll find my way into it. And
whatever you say, man.
Yeah, like, all right, shit, I'll see you on stage kind of thing. And this was nice, because it's like, okay, like, this is going to be obviously my experience and my words, but he was steering the ship from the beginning a little bit, and that was took a lot of trust. And in the process of doing that, I kept them much more stripped down, because I don't know, like, it just felt like that just felt right. And so I didn't even really, I mean, I made some horn charts and I did some arrangement stuff, but it was like, we recorded this in my studio here, and that was the first time that I've recorded an album where I didn't feel like I was on the clock financially as well, right? So instead of it being, we have 4 days to do this whole thing or else we're going to run out of money, it was like, all right, Aki, our guitarist, come on in, like, let's mess around with this, and really traded it on the fact that I've known these people for 10 years now.
It's funny, you were describing this process of kind of going backwards when it comes to the day job thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds to me like you've also kind of backed yourself into a far more traditional method of writing rock songs.
Yeah, well, I hope it's from a place of choice rather than.
When I say backed in, I just mean that you, like most people, start simple and get more complicated, and you've gone the other way.
Yeah, and like I think that there's actually there's something really rewarding about doing that, because it's during the pandemic, for some extra money, Alan and I did this like songwriting thing where we talked to some of our fans about songwriting. It was like a class that we kind of did, and in the process of doing that, I was shocked at how many opinions I had about just the craft of songwriting, which I had always sort of thought of as like that the way that I wrote songs was more sort of music first, and it was about kind of the arrangements and the tapestry and the sort of the intoxicating quality of how things work together sonically. And then I was like, no, I actually really care about when the chorus hits, or I care about, what I care about bridges. I care about not caring about bridges. I actually don't like bridges, And so I had all these sort of funny things that were sort of codified for me in the course of talking about it. And I thought, there's something nice about taking the craft really seriously and just trying to build a great house, rather than be like, ooh, my house has all sorts of weird shit on it. So it was fun.
It sounds like the process of, it wasn't like a full-on teaching job, but you were teaching in a sense, played an important role in the creation of this record.
It certainly clarified some stuff for me about songwriting. I think where I go from here is an open question, and I've already thought a little bit about a next record, and I think that would be probably, I wouldn't do the same record again. I think I bring some things back in, and I think it's important as a songwriter and as a composer both to be constantly trying new things, to be codifying your sound and to making sure that you have a really a unique voice, but at the same time, if you're just going to be in one place, I think that's where's the fun in that? So we'll see where it goes, but this is a fun one to kind of nuts and bolts. How do you write a song? How do you observe a heartbreak? How do you try to do something that feels honest and not too melodramatic, even though during a time you're probably feeling kind of that way?
How do you avoid the navel gazing? And how do you avoid falling into the cliches that every single person who's written a breakup album falls into? Or do you have to embrace them to a certain extent?
Yeah, I think the thing I try to keep in mind is, because the experience of a listener is actually built into my writing, because my first listeners are my singers, and they have to like it and relate. I hope that there's a kind of a generosity built into how I write, where, even like the lyrics that I'm setting, the lyrics I'm writing, it's like I want to make sure that they all feel that there's a certain kind of point of entry for them, and that they're not just like, here's what I had for lunch today, there are great songwriters who do that, who just tell you what they had for lunch today, and you just believe them because they sound amazing, and there's something really specific about the way they observe it. But the way I try to stay out of the navel gazy thing, I think, is just by constantly trying to find shared ground between me, my singers, and a sort of an imaginary audience who might be going through something similar.
Again, because I'm reading a Philip Glass book right now, and I highlighted something. I can't find the exact quote, but he says something that's like very obvious on the face of it when he says it, but that I hadn't considered that way. But to completely paraphrase him, something along the lines of that art is about looking and that music is about listening.
Yeah.
And really, and taking, and I guess really considering how it's consumed is a big part of actually creating that work.
Well, it's a temporal time form. You have to, at the very least, give 3 minutes of your life to listen to a song, and then usually if you're asking for them to listen to an album, it's, 45 minutes. And if you're asking them to listen to an opera, it's 3 hours, or whatever. So I think there's a awareness of that I always carry with me, because there's nothing that I dislike more than something that doesn't know when to end, musically. And so there's maybe, I guess I just, that's that communal aspect of like music making is what drives my whole thing and my whole desire to make it. And so why get too, blindersy, navel gazy about it if you're trying to bring people in and find shared ground.
Pop music versus classical music or opera. Pop music has this built-in time limit to it. So it seems like it's easier to know when to get out of it because it's baked into the process, but perhaps it's a lot more difficult to convey all of the things that you want to convey in a 3-minute song versus as you said, a 3-hour opera.
Yeah, I think maybe it's about scale, right? Like, if I'm going to extrapolate the lessons from making even this album, but a song doesn't have to say everything, what is it? I think it's a Shostakovich quote, or no, it's a Mahler quote. Just like that, his symphony, it's like, it must contain everything is I think what he said. Which cool, man, like good on you.
Good. He's good at that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he really is going for it. I think when I was a little bit more immature about what I was doing, I think I felt that everything must contain everything. But actually 3 minutes is a great period of time to give like one smart observation with maybe a little, some kind of a little moment of, whatever, like Alan calls it, the calf tattoo line. It's like the line that you really think about and you remember. And that's maybe actually in something small like that, it can contain the world. It can contain a lot. I mean, songs, they're 3-minute songs that are some of the most important 3 minutes, that you can give. But I think they're more like poems, right? You're looking at one little thing and you're seeing a lot in something small, as opposed to an opera where you're trying to say a lot in something big, or maybe something simple in something big. Some of my favorite operas and theater pieces are things that, you have this big sprawling story, and at the end it's like, there's maybe it all kind of crystallizes in some sort of beautiful little way.
It's a calf tattoo moment because that's you get the quote tattooed on your calf. Is that the idea?
Yeah, it's the one. You're right. It's like someone comes up to you after the show and shows you the line, and it's tattooed on their calf. I've
not heard that, so I assume that's an Alanism.
Yeah, that was. I think it's probably we do have some pretty intense fans, and I have seen a fair number of things like that, and so I think at one point we were just talking about how crazy it is to see a line that kind of was maybe tossed off, right? Like there's a line in one of our songs in Methuselah. It's just like this line, I don't think of you when I'm missing you, which I remember writing, and I was like, that's not a good one, but I just gotta keep going. And then that line kind of, the context of it, it carried more weight for within the song. And then I've seen that tattooed on people, and it's like, wow, it's so weird to see a small, almost like throwaway thing, become something that's very meaningful and very real to someone. So that's kind of nice.
What's the feeling like the first time you see that somebody has tattooed words that you've written on their body?
It's very humbling is the wrong word because that's such a silly word, I find, but it's very grounding or something. It's like, whoa, I think it gives you context that these songs aren't yours anymore. And often the person who gets the tattoo or who does their first dance to one of your songs and they're at their wedding, what that song means to them it's not what it meant to you, and actually it doesn't matter. Like what it means to them is just as valid, and probably more so because they're the ones living the experience. And so I think there's actually a sort of a undercutting of ego in a way that's kind of nice, where you're like, wow, this thing, it meant something to me, and then I let it go, and and now it means something totally different to you. So there's something cool about that, I think. And maybe a little bit embarrassing for me, where I'm like, shit, like if I had come up with a better line, it would be a better tattoo.
This is something I talk to people about all the time, because it's something that I have been trying to get better about myself, is accepting the compliment and not having the impulse to say like, oh, that's the one you like. That I've done much better. That's my worst thing. And like all of a sudden, like you're shitting on this thing that just meant so much to that person.
And I think actually the experience of performing, probably also of being in your role currently, is like, with having listeners, is actually really destructive to the ability to accept a compliment, right? Because you just stop trusting people pretty quickly. I would feel, after a year of touring, I was just like, I used to really enjoy talking to people after the show, and now I just find myself feeling a little bit alienated because I'm not letting the nice things sink in. Like, I'm trying to read into the things that you say that are nice and make them bad, and you just lose this kind of trust that anyone is saying anything real to you. And I think that is hard to then come back to your regular life and turn off.
Yeah, I mean, and it gets back to what we were saying before, that music is about listening.
Yeah.
Because it's the person and how they interpret it, and the fact that once it's in the world, it's not really yours anymore.
Totally. Yeah. And, and it shouldn't be. I don't think that that's the role of recorded music. I think it's not the role of live music either. I think it's like, if you're truly committed to the community and if you're committed to the experience of connecting and sharing, then you have to share.
As soon as I leave, I just wanna come back. And I know this is gonna end badly, 'cause it feels like you are the one thing